The response was quick and decisive. "It figures," wrote one friend. "Sadly mystifying and just incoherent," said another. A third concluded that Berry was simply making large concessions to present societal norms. And if that were the case, we ought to throw out everything Berry's ever written on economics. Oh my. How could this be? Wendell Berry, the defender of the family and the farm and all things natural and fecund, a poet who offers high praise of marriage and the love between a woman and a man, an essayist who excoriates sexual libertines and ridicules the delusions of safe sex. Surely something was amiss here. But there it was, on a computer screen Berry himself would never view. According to John Miller, in a recent interview published by National Review, when asked about gay marriage, Berry replied, quote, "I'm in favor of it too," he says. "It's really only because they're being denied the benefits of inheritance and so on. Otherwise, I don't think it ought to be the government's business." According to Miller, he regards the entire debate as a distraction. Quote, "I really don't understand how you can single out homosexuality for opprobrium and wink at fornication and adultery, which the Bible has a lot more to say about. The churches are not going to come out against fornication and adultery because there are too damn many fornicators and adulterers in the congregations." He's absolutely correct about the fornicators and the adulterers, but it doesn't follow that gay marriage should be the law of the land. How should one understand Berry's apparent non sequitur? Perhaps the simplest answer is that Berry is taking his own advice offered in the marvelous poem Manifesto, the Mad Farmer Liberation Front. There Berry tells his reader, "So, friends, every day do something that won't compute." It turns out there was no news here. As early as 2005, in his letter to Daniel Kimmis, Berry had addressed the question of same-sex marriage in an open letter in which he confessed his frustrations with his own Democratic Party. Quote, "It is surely because of moral timidity or incompetence of the Democrats that the Republicans have been able to reduce the issue of values to a mere three: evolution, abortion, and homosexuality." End quote. On evolution, he saw no necessary conflict between Genesis and modern science, but lots of condescension and contempt on the part of liberal intellectuals and a failure of imagination on the part of Christian fundamentalists. On abortion, contrary to his fellow Democrats, he declared, quote, "I'm opposed to abortion except as a last resort to save a pregnant woman's life. The crucial question raised by this practice is, what is killed? The answer can only be a human being." Unquote. On the subject of homosexuality, he thought the Democrats had mishandled this issue as well. Quote, "It seems to be a sort of folklore of liberalism that any group that has suffered from a categorical disapproval should be compensated by categorical approval. But this is nonsense." End quote. What Berry then says about gay marriage deserves to be quoted in full. Quote, "By raising the issue of homosexual marriage, by making it a political issue, I think homosexuals have done themselves and the rest of us a disservice. That is, they have invited the government to make a public judgment of people's private sexual behavior, which ought to be none of the government's business, so long as the behavior is not abusive of other people. Government approval of anybody's sexual behavior is as inappropriate and as offensive to freedom as governmental disapproval. The government's interest in people's living arrangements should go no further than domestic partnerships, which ought to give the same legal protections and rights to widowed sisters or bachelor brothers or friends or partners living together as married couples. Justice, and with luck, mercy, should be the government's business. Let sacraments such as marriage be the business of religions and communities. Until lately, anyhow, marriage was not thought to be a right. It was a requirement, a part of the communal means, often misled or ignored, of sexual responsibility." End quote. There are a variety of issues here that won't compute. Is Berry even making a defense of same-sex marriage? It seems doubtful that much of the LGBTQ community would see it as such, since so many have made it clear that they want so much more than domestic partnerships. Berry's language is problematic in other ways as well. In the past, he has denied that sexual behavior is private and even ridiculed the term partner as an adequate replacement term for husband or wife. Most importantly, there is the question of whether marriage is a right. In that statement, Berry seems to suggest that until recently there was no right to marriage. Has that changed? Does it matter? Trying to make sense of these seeming contradictions, I reread a number of Berry's essays and poems. Most importantly, I reread Berry's magnificent 1993 essay, Sex, Economy, Freedom, and Community. He accomplishes much in this essay, especially in his ridicule of the cult of liberated sexuality and its delusions of free, private, and safe sex. I sought to square his 2000 affirmation of something like same-sex marriage with his long-standing affirmation of sexual love as the embodiment of our participation in the natural world. Quote, "Sexual love is the force that in our bodily life that connects us most intimately to the creation, to the fertility of the world, to farming, and to the care of animals. It brings us into the dance that holds the community together and joins it to its place." End quote. Homosexuality is simply not discussed in that essay. He uses the Clarence Thomas and Anita Hill conflict as the starting point, and his references are all to the exchanges between men and women. For instance, he notes, quote, "We are now living in a sexual atmosphere so polluted and embittered that women must look on virtually any man as a potential assailant, and a man must look on virtually any woman as a potential accuser." End quote. There are repeated indictments against sexual liberation and promiscuity, but it doesn't follow that Berry means to include homosexual intercourse under those labels, even if many of his readers assume that he does. Instead, Berry offers a strong defense of the sanctity and solemnity of marriage. If you depreciate this, quote, "If you depreciate the sanctity and solemnity of marriage, not just as a bond between two people and their forebears, their children and their neighbors, then you have prepared the way for an epidemic of divorce, child neglect, community ruin, and loneliness." End quote. Most opponents of gay marriage believe that gay marriage threatens the marriage of a man and a woman, and that it will lead to the ills Berry mentions and worse. Supporters of gay marriage will argue, on the contrary, that they are affirming the sanctity and solemnity of marriage, not depreciating it. Moreover, if they are restricted only to domestic partnerships, they will have lost an indispensable opportunity to demonstrate Berry's rightful appeal to sanctity and solemnity. It's not difficult for the proponent of exclusively heterosexual marriages to read Sex, Economy, Freedom, and Community as a vigorous defense of this notion of marriage and community. To read Sex, Economy, Freedom, and Community as a vigorous defense of this notion of marriage and community, regarding it as a warning against the libertine sexuality of personal preference and self-fulfillment espoused by many within the gay rights movement. It's not impossible to read the essay as including monogamous homosexual unions within the confines of marriage, but it cannot be read as defending bisexual or transgendered practices which justify multiple sexual partnerships. Indeed, Berry is explicit in his condemnation of promiscuity, and the notion of marriage that he has in mind extends only to those that give themselves in complete fidelity until they are parted by death. It is enormously difficult, by contrast, to read the essay as including a defense of gay marriage. There is no mention of homosexual unions, and the repeated references to married life, for instance, his exposition of Portia's giving of herself to Bassanio in The Merchant of Venice, clearly imply traditional heterosexual marriages. According to Berry, quote, "And so here, at the very heart of community life, we find not something to sell, as in the public market, but this momentous giving. If the community cannot protect this giving, it can protect nothing, and our time is proving that this is so." End quote. What follows from this? Is Berry suggesting that what really matters is for the community to protect faithful relationships of this sort, be they heterosexual or homosexual? Or that failure to protect the traditional understanding of giving in marriage has consequences far greater than one can imagine? The latter certainly seems to be the case, but Berry's language makes it far from clear. At the heart of this issue is what is entailed by marriage. And it seems to me that Berry equivocates with his use of this all-important word, both here and in other contexts, such as the letter to Chemists. One need not enter into the troubled waters of what counts as a right and whether marriage now qualifies. Berry rightly seems to recognize that Christian marriage is a sacrament, and that government has no business policing the sacraments. Much of the Christian community has failed to understand that our endorsement of the transformation of marriage from sacrament to contract has been calamitous. A sacrament is a visible symbol of God's invisible grace administered by the body of Christ. A contract is a voluntary agreement that creates legal obligations between its parties. What kind of a thing we think marriage is matters a great deal. But Berry equivocates. He uses the term marriage as a stand-in for domestic partnerships, not only of homosexual couples, but also widowed sisters and bachelor brothers, among others. Berry wants these partnerships to be accorded the legal protections and tax advantages which are granted to married couples. In short, he endorses same-sex marriages and other partnerships as contracts. Careful readers of Berry's poetry would never conclude that he thinks of marriage principally as a legal contract. In his 1973 poem, The Country of Marriage, he movingly describes marriage. Our bond is no little economy based on the exchange of my love and work for yours, so much for so much of an expendable fund. We don't know what its limits are. That puts it in the dark. We are more together than we know. How else could we keep on discovering that we are more together than we thought? You are the known way leading always to the unknown. You are the known place to which the unknown is always leading me back. Here, marriage is no mere contract. Even in Sex, Economy, Freedom, and Community, he describes marriage as, quote, that which joins two living souls as closely as in this world they can be joined, quote. Could this apply to homosexual unions? This can only be accomplished, it seems, by equating anal and vaginal intercourse, and even then they are hardly equal, since the latter offers a potentiality and a fecundity which is denied to the former. My guess is that Berry has struggled with this issue and with his uncertainty about it for many years. He vigorously condemns the notion that, quote, whatever people desire is natural and all right, unquote. And he includes in his list of indictments such community-subverting acts as discourteous behavior, divorce, child abandonment, promiscuity, adultery, abortion, and prostitution of sex in advertisements and public entertainment. He does not include homosexuality in the list. And yet, at the same time, he deplores the loss of traditional understandings. Quote, seeking to free sexual love from its old communal restraints, we have freed it also from its meaning, its responsibility, and its exaltation. And skipping a bit. And in the midst of this acid rainfall of predation and recrimination, we presume to teach our young people that sex can be made safe by the use, inevitably, of purchased drugs and devices. What a lie. Sex was never safe, and it is less safe now than it has ever been. End quote. Near the conclusion of Sex, Economy, Freedom, and Community, Berry makes two moves, the first of which seems to undermine an argument for gay marriage, and the second of which might plausibly be read as a plea to be open to its possibility, though in neither case is gay marriage explicitly mentioned. First of all, Berry notes the, quote, various movements of rights and liberties, unquote, of the last 30 years that have too easily succumbed to the special pleading which merely privileges the individual desires of this or that group. Quote, the problem with this form of pluralism is that it has no authentic standard. Its standard simply is what one group or another may want at the moment, end quote. Genuine community freedom cannot be achieved, quote, by the present-day pluralist's easy assumption that all cultures are equal or of equal value and capable of surviving together because of tolerance. The idea of equality is a good one, so long as it means equality before the law. This, end quote. This, of course, reflects the latter comment about equality and legal protections and rights. Berry continues, quote, beyond that, equality before the law, the idea becomes squishy and sentimental because of manifest inequalities of all kinds. It makes no sense, for example, to equate equality with freedom." End quote. But secondly, real communities based on authentic freedom cannot ignore what Berry calls the reality of significant differences. He concludes with a plea for knowledge and respect, especially because the latter, quote, "always implies imagination, the ability to see another across our inevitable differences as living souls," end quote. And there, I believe, lies the answer to Wendell Berry's equivocal regard for the notion of gay marriage, which his own writings seem to call into question time and again. He believes that compassion, respect, and imagination demand it. It comes from his desire to see the other across inevitable differences as a living soul. It follows from the mad farmer's affirmation to, quote, "give approval to all you cannot understand, praise ignorance, for what man has not encountered he has not destroyed," end quote. I believe Berry's equivocation is one born out of his own humility, compassion, and genuine love and affection for homosexual friends, neighbors, and even strangers. He is, I suspect, especially touched by the plight of those homosexual Christians who have so often suffered sanctified hatred from other Christians, allegedly brothers and sisters in Christ who fail to recognize that heterosexual promiscuity is indistinguishable from its homosexual twin. No doubt he has seen faithful monogamous households and communities that stand with him against a sexual libertinism that, quote, glamorizes and glorifies drugs, promiscuity, pornography, violence, and blasphemy, end quote. My own suspicion is that Berry would like to acknowledge the legitimacy of the natural bond found in same-sex relationships and to defend it against those who would seek to use the power of government to punish homosexuals, either through criminalizing their behavior or denying them the legal protections afforded to other couples, without endorsing same-sex intercourse. I think there is part of Berry that would like to call for discipline and celibacy in homosexual relationships, in much the same way in which he has called for discipline, modesty, and restraint in heterosexual relationships. But Berry will not make this claim because he has not lived this life. In much the same way that he laments those who write about farming who have never turned the soil, he will not prescribe a life of celibacy for those who travel a road that he himself has not taken. And so he equivocates. Equivocation, however, is a failure of language, and it is deadly to argument. Here, Berry's compassion begins to look squishy and sentimental in precisely the ways that he has sought to avoid. If it is a failure, especially of language, it is particularly disconcerting because Berry has been one of the best at reminding us of how easily we are comforted by the consolations of equivocation. In the essay Standing by Words, he rebukes a certain fashionable imprecision of language which forgets the communal nature of words and absolves the speaker of his responsibility for them. Quote, "For once precision is abandoned as a linguistic or a literary virtue, vague generalization is one of the two remaining possibilities, gibberish being the second. And without precise accounting leading to responsible action, there is no escape from the Shelleyan rhythm of exaltation and despair, ideal passions culminating in real disasters." End quote. In other places, Berry has argued passionately and persuasively for the necessary limitations that accompany both our words and the institutions to which they refer. For instance, in the essay Poetry and Marriage, the Use of Old Terms, he writes, quote, "The names poetry and marriage are given only to certain things, not to anything or to everything." Skipping a bit. "Marriage is the mutual promise of a man and a woman to live together, to love and help each other in mutual fidelity until death. It is understood that these definitions cannot be altered to suit convenience or circumstance any more than we can call a rabbit a squirrel because we prefer to see a squirrel." End quote. And the essay, Imagination in Place, Berry compares, unsurprisingly, writing to farming. According to Berry, one can't learn how to plow a field or break a colt by reading a book. Quote, "You can't deal with things merely according to category. You are continually required to consider the distinct individuality of an animal or a tree, or the uniqueness of a place or a situation. And to do so, you must draw upon the long accumulation of experience, your own and other people's. Moreover, you are always under pressure to explain to somebody, often yourself, exactly what needs to be done. All of this calls for exactly particularizing language. This is the right kind of language for a writer, a language developing, so to speak, from the ground up." End quote. Exactly particularizing language on the subject of gay marriage is what we need from Wendell Berry, but we do not get it. We do not even get models or exemplars of such faithful monogamous homosexual relationships among the membership of Port William in his novels and short stories. I have not read all the fiction, but I've read most of it, and I cannot remember any significant homosexual marriages or partnerships or unions that approximate the giving and receiving that he convincingly portrays in the marriages of Hannah and Nathan Coulter, Matt and Margaret Feltner, or of Lyda and Danny Branch. Among other marriages, we see some that struggle, such as Andy and Flora Catlett, several that fail, like Old Jack and Ruth Beecham, and even a few not quite married marriages, like Burley Coulter and Kate Helen Branch. We encounter a good deal of infidelity and longing and disappointment, as well as an ample measure of patience, fulfillment, and forgiveness. Some of the deepest heartache is found in those men who love women who cannot love them back in the same way. In one instance, a burden carried faithfully by Jaber Crow, and in another, tragically relinquished by Ernest Finley. It's in the fiction, not in the essays, where we expect to be shown the exactly particular language that we need in order to make sense of the world and the place of gay marriage. But it's not there. Why so many paths? I know better than to try to turn novels into arguments or transform poetic discourse into syllogisms. But it's hard to square Berry the essayist's stern demand for knowledge and justification with Berry the poet's celebration of reverent ignorance and humble approval of all that one does not understand. Berry recognizes this as well. When asked how all of his work fits together, he has replied, awkwardly. Is he seeking to hold both sides accountable to one another, to find that via media which splits the difference? Critics on the left may be grateful for the gesture, but they will surely be discontent with the small affirmation which most of his work denies. Some might accuse him of cowardice for failing to offer a fulsome defense of their civil rights. Critics on the right may see it as an incoherence, a self-refuting contradiction, or even a malicious misdirection which plays both sides against the middle. Some might ask whether he is willing to extend the same sort of reverent affirmation to alternative views of agricultural and technological innovation which form new communities even as they challenge traditional ones. Were I not so indebted to the work of Wendell Berry, I could, perhaps, shake my head and walk away from this curious endorsement as the quirky contrariness of the mad farmer. This response dismisses Berry and his work, however, with more disrespect than will be heaped on him by the most earnest cultural warriors on both the left and the right. Though Berry's equivocal affirmation may have its roots in deeply personal encounters, it's not sufficient to pass this off as a consequence of personality. Berry wants us to take him seriously, all of it, the parts that fit together and the parts that do not. To take seriously a point of view with which one thinks one disagrees is to seek vigorously but patiently to learn from that which previously we suspected to be problematic. So it is with the care for creation and its creatures. Patience and humility are the prerequisites for our ability both to know and to act as good stewards. Perhaps the direction toward an answer is to be found in the 2002 poem, Some Further Words. Here, Berry promises to be plain with us and not give in to fashionable lies, but he cautions us against taking our own little clockworks of explanation as the final arbiter of truth and justice. He writes, and in what I'm reading here, I skip a couple of stanzas. My purpose is a language that can make us whole, though mortal, ignorant, and small. The world is whole beyond human knowing. The body's life is its own, untouched by the little clockwork of explanation. And just as tenderly to be known are the affections that make a woman and a man, their household and their homeland one. These two, though known, cannot be told to those who do not know them, and fewer of us learn them year by year. These affections are leaving the world like colors of extinct birds, like the songs of a dead language. Think of the genius of the animals, every one truly what it is: gnat, fox, minnow, swallow, each made of light and luminous within itself. They know better than we do how to live in the places where they live. And so I would like to be a true human being, dear reader, a choice not altogether possible now. But this is what I'm for, the side I'm on. And this is what you should expect of me, as I expected of myself, though for realization we may wait 1,000 or 1,000,000 years. End quote. Berry is not opposed to contrariness or to risking offense. Yet the charges of cowardice, contradiction, and incoherence fail to do justice to Berry's attempt to tell the whole truth that he sees. To be a true human being, one must tell the truth that we see. Even when he must tell the truth that he sees, even when he recognizes that it may only awkwardly cohere, or perhaps not at all. The task is to live faithfully and speak truthfully. He tells it all in the strong hope and good faith that one day we may see how it all fits together, or else be transformed by a more persuasive account. For now we see through a glass darkly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then shall I know, even also as I am known. It may take 1,000 years, but that's okay. I choose to take the mad farmer seriously, even when I seriously disagree with some of his conclusions. After all, he's like the fox, who makes more tracks than are necessary, some in the wrong direction. Thank you.
Pulpits make me a little nervous. You always put your feet right over the top of the audience, so I hope I won't step on anybody's head. I thank you for the opportunity to speak here where I've been before. And I am grateful to Professor Moore and to all of my critics, really. The great assurance-giving thing for a writer is to assume that he'll be disagreed with. If I got the impression that somebody believed everything I said, I think I would be literally dumbfounded. I would be afraid to say anymore. Because, but anyway, I'm grateful particularly for this criticism because it required me to think it through again, or to think it through for the first time. I must say that it's a little wonderful to me that in 40-odd years of taking stands on controversial issues, and at great length sometimes. The two times when I think I've stirred up the most passionate opposition has been with a tiny little essay on computers and half a dozen or a dozen sentences on gay marriage. Well, Professor Moore's paper is cordial, and rather than respond directly to it, I thought I'd just take this occasion to make a sort of general declaration on this subject. In the present political atmosphere, it is assumed that everybody must be on one of only two sides, liberal or conservative. It doesn't matter that neither of these labels signifies much in the way of intellectual responsibility, or that both are paralyzed in the face of the overpowering issue of our time, the destruction of land and people, of life itself, by means either economic or military. What does matter is that a person should choose one side or the other, accept the thinking and the positions of that side and its institutions, and be so identified forevermore. How you vote is who you are. Above all, one must not cause confusion among the loyalists. If the liberals or conservatives agree with you on one thing, they're entitled to be shocked to find that they don't agree with you on everything. It follows that you must not change your mind about mere issues. The only change that is expectable or normal is to go from one of these disreputable sides all the way over to the other, changing in effect your identity, which is understood to be no more or less than your side. We appear thus to have evolved into a sort of teenage culture of wishful thinking, of contending positions, oversimplified and absolute, requiring no knowledge and no thought, no loss, no tragedy, no strenuous effort, no bewilderment, no hard choices. Of the contention of American conservatives and liberals in the Cold War politics of the 1950s, John Lukács remarked that the opposition of two stupidities does not mean that the truth is somewhere in the middle. Nowhere has this callow politics asserted itself more thoughtlessly and noisily than on the rights of abortion and homosexual marriage. The real issue here is the politicization of personal or private life, and inevitably, given the absence of authentic political discourse, the reduction of the issues to two absolute positions. In addition to distracting from interests authentically public and political, the politicization of personal life, involving as it must the publicization of privacy, is inhumane and inherently tyrannical. After Boris Pasternak's Dr. Zhivago was published in the West, receiving the Nobel Prize in 1958, and the bitter Soviet reprisal against Pasternak, Thomas Merton wrote, "Communism is not at home with non-political categories, and it cannot deal with a phenomenon which is not in some way political. It is characteristic of the singular logic of Stalinist Marxism that when it incorrectly diagnoses some phenomenon as political, it corrects the error by forcing the thing to become political." Paradoxically, perhaps, after our many decades of anti-communism, Merton's sentences have come to be descriptive of our own politics. Or maybe this is not paradoxical. Maybe people who focus their minds for a long time upon enmity against their enemies finally begin to resemble their enemies. This has happened before. It is deeply embedded in the logic of warfare. Whatever the cause, we seem to have become as adept as the old Soviet Union in politicizing the non-political. Most remarkably, by the connivances of both political sides, we have invented a politics of sexuality, which by the standards of our own political tradition is a contradiction in terms. Or it is, if there is to be a continuing political distinction between public and private. This distinction, after all, is the basis of the freedoms affirmed by the First Amendment, which holds essentially that people's thoughts and beliefs are of no legitimate interest to the government. The government is not in charge of our personal lives, our private affections, our prayers, or our political opinions. It is not in charge of our souls. Those who formed our government also limited it, forbidding it any freehold in our homes or in our minds. I am as ready as any so-called conservative to worry about big government, though I would remember that government has gotten big in the much-needed effort to regulate big corporations and to help their victims. To my fear of big government, I add my at least equal fear of unlimited government, which is to say, total government. It is not entirely surprising that after our long, costly resistance to communist dictatorship, we should now see the rise of passions and excuses tending toward capitalist dictatorship. The most insidious of these passions tends toward state religion and government regulation of private behavior. The politics of sexuality has to do with public disagreements about rights, which, however valid, are newly proclaimed, obscure in origin, extremely controversial, and productive of conflicts that probably are not politically resolvable. Regarding homosexual marriage, the fault that I must acknowledge is that in what I have said before, I have not been complete enough. So far as I remember, I have made only 2 public statements about this issue. The first was in a single paragraph in a collection of essays, The Way of Ignorance, published in 2005. The second was in an interview for an article in National Review in 2012. My argument, much abbreviated both times, was that sexual practices of consenting adults ought not to be subjected to the government's approval or disapproval, and that domestic partnerships in which people who live together and devote their lives to one another ought to receive the spousal rights, protections, and privileges that the government allows to heterosexual couples. In those 2 statements, I considered homosexual marriage as an issue of law, with reference to the contention from both sides that marriage is a right to be granted or withheld at the wish of whichever side may dominate by the government. This puts me in the middle, but with some certainty of my whereabouts and with good reasons to object. First, this right to marriage is still birth wet. It exists, oddly, only by reason of its being selectively withheld. Apart from its momentary political expediency, there is no reason for it. Whatever one may think of all that is presently implied and entailed by the legalization of marriage, surely nobody can claim that marriage is either the government's invention or the government has an inherent right to determine who may marry. Second, this right depends upon a curious agreement between liberals and conservatives that human rights originate in government, to be dispensed to the people according to their pleading and at the government's pleasure, implying inescapably that any right, being so expediently the government's gift, can just as expediently be withheld or withdrawn by the government. This flatly contradicts the founding principle of American democracy, that human rights are precedent to the government's existence, that the government is established to protect them, and that the government must be restrained from violating them. Third, it cannot be allowable under the above principles for the government, on the pleading of some of the people, to establish a right solely for the purpose of withholding it from some other people. This, if it were to happen, would be a punishment imposed upon a disfavored group for no crime except their existence. I don't need to point out that this has happened before. That the liberals, who so often have been rightly anxious for the protection of rights and liberties, should define those rights and liberties as merely the gifts of a generous and parental government is absurd. The conservative program on this issue, promoting as it does a constitutional apportionment of rights according to sexual category, in implicit violation of the 15th and 19th Amendments, is more darkly absurd. It also raises absurdity to high comedy in the theory that accreditation of the sexual practices of individuals is a function proper to a small and non-interfering government. That homosexuals have been denied the right to marry, supposing for the moment that such a right can exist, surely violates the 14th Amendment, which forbids the state to deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, or to deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. There is no need for homosexuals to be granted a right to marry that is at all different from the right of heterosexuals to do so. There is no good reason for the government to treat homosexuals as a special category of persons, which is the same discrimination that has been removed from races and increasingly from women. To support their strategy of outlawing homosexual marriage, Christians of a certain disposition have found several ways to categorize homosexuals as a different kind from themselves, who are in the category of heterosexuality and therefore normal and therefore good. They are mindful that the Bible looks upon homosexual acts as sinful or perverse. But it is not clear to me why perversion should have been so specifically assigned to homosexuality. The Bible, as I pointed out to the writer for National Review, has a lot more to say against fornication and adultery than against homosexuality. If one accepts the 24th and 104th Psalms as scriptural norms, then surface mining and other forms of earth destruction clearly are perversions. If we take the gospel seriously, how can we not see industrial warfare with its inevitable massacre of innocents as a most shocking perversion? By the standard of all the scriptures, neglect of the poor, of widows and orphans, of the sick, the homeless, the insane, is an abominable perversion. Jesus taught that hating your neighbor is tantamount to hating God. And yet some Christians hate their neighbors by policy and are busy hunting biblical justifications for doing so. Are they not perverts in the fullest and fairest sense of that term? And yet none of these offenses, not all of them together, has made as much political religious noise as homosexual marriage. Another way to categorize and isolate homosexuals from the general citizenry and the prerogatives of citizenship is to define homosexuality as a disease, supposing that homosexuality has a cause that can be discovered and removed or cured by some sort of therapy. This seems most promising as long-term job security for scientists. Ken Kesey once saw an inscription in a men's room, "My mother made me a homosexual." Under it, somebody else had written, "If I gave her the yarn, would she make me one?" My own speculation is that we will never do much better than that. We will discover that like all the rest of us, homosexuals are made what they are by their mothers, their fathers, their genes, their germs, their upbringing, their education, by their friends and neighbors, their dwelling places, their time and its culture, by their economic and social status, by their personal history, and by history. Another such argument, of course, is that homosexuality is unnatural. If the nature in question is merely biological, the realm of the ape and the naked ape, that may prove too roomy and accommodating to be of much help. By the standard of that nature, monogamous marriage itself is unnatural. It is an artifact of some cultures. If it is argued that homosexual marriage cannot be reproductive, is therefore unnatural, and should be forbidden on that account, must we not then argue that childless marriages are unnatural and should be annulled? Specifically, human nature, by contrast, has always had a definition more complex and demanding than that of a naked ape. William Blake thought we are made human by being made in the image of God. For mercy, pity, peace, and love is God our Father dear, and mercy, pity, peace, and love is man, his child, and care. Are homosexuals capable of mercy, pity, peace, and love? Some certainly are, as some heterosexuals certainly are. To deny that distinction to homosexuals is to deny categorically that they are human, hardly a job for mercy, pity, peace, and love. The perception of a duality, sometimes a conflicting duality in human life, a profound and troubling difference between natural nature, so to speak, and human nature, was continuous in our culture until our own age of scientific materialism. In the great chain of being, now much maligned but never replaced, we humans stand between the animals and the angels, partaking of both natures, attracted and influenced by both. This duality is resolved not by victories over enemies, but by fidelity to our own nature. This is difficult, involving always our ignorance, our unintelligence, and therefore much confusion and suffering. And this difficulty defines exactly our need for mercy, pity, peace, and love. Oversimplified moral certainties, always requiring hostility, always potentially violent, isolate us from mercy, pity, peace, and love, and leave us lonely and dangerous in our misery. The only perfect laws are absolute, but perfect laws are only approximately fitted to imperfect humans. That is why we have needed to think of mercy and of the Spirit as opposed to the letter of the law. One may find the sexual practices of homosexuals to be unattractive or displeasing, and therefore unnatural. But anything that can be done in that line by homosexuals can be done and is done by heterosexuals. Do we need a political remedy for this? Would conservative Christians like a small government bureau to inspect, approve, and certify their sexual behavior? Would they like a colorful tattoo verifying government approval on the rumps of lawfully copulating parties? We have the technology, after all, to monitor everybody's sexual behavior. But so far as I can see, so eager an interest in other people's most private intimacy is either prurient or totalitarian or both. The oddest of the strategies to condemn and isolate homosexuals is to propose that homosexual marriage is opposed to and a threat to heterosexual marriage, as if the marriage market is about to be cornered and monopolized by homosexuals. If this is not industrial capitalist paranoia, it at least follows the pattern of industrial capitalist competitiveness, You must destroy the competition. If somebody else wants what you've got, from money to marriage, you must not hesitate to use the government, small, of course, to keep them from getting it. But hold on. If heterosexual marriage is so satisfying to homosexual couples, why can they not just reside in their satisfaction? So-called traditional marriage, now mostly divested of a traditional household and traditional bonds to a community, is for sure suffering a statistical failure. But this is not the result of a homosexual plot. Heterosexual marriage does not need defending. It only needs to be practiced, which is pretty hard to do just now. But the difficulty is not assignable to any group of scapegoats. It is rooted mainly in the values and priorities of our industrial capitalist system in which every one of us is complicit. I have dealt so far with the politics of a legal definition of marriage. It certainly is possible for a government to withhold the legal perquisites of marriage from any group that it may designate, or that it may be persuaded to designate in our present civil Cold War. That is mainly to say that a government can forbid its officers to license weddings for people in the designated group. But a wedding is not a marriage. A wedding, in some circumstances, for some people, may be a sacrament. It is traditionally an exchange of vows of fidelity and love in all circumstances until death. A wedding, however complicated and costly the preparations, the costumes, the photography, and the reception, is made and done with in a few minutes. A marriage, by contrast, is the making of marriage. The effort day by day to live out the vows until death. The vows in the long making may be taken seriously or not, broken or not, but there is no way of withholding them from homosexuals. You cannot exclude homosexuals from their language, and you cannot copyright the vows, which a homosexual couple is perfectly free to make. The government cannot forbid them to do so, nor can any church. They can be spoken in secrecy, in whispers, by any couple wanting to speak them. Conjugal love, Kierkegaard wrote, is faithful, constant, humble, patient, long-suffering, indulgent, sincere, contented, vigilant, willing, joyful. All these virtues, he said, have the characteristic that they are inward qualifications of the individual. Inward qualifications. The individual is not fighting with external foes, but fights with himself. Conjugal love does not come with any outward sign, with whizzing and bluster, but it is the imperishable nature of a quiet spirit. That's from Either Or. No church can make this marriage because it cannot make any marriage, nor can it withhold any degree of blessedness or sanctity from any pledged couple striving day by day to be at one. If I were one of a homosexual couple, the same as I am one of a heterosexual couple, I would place my faith and hope in the mercy of Christ, not in the judgment of Christians. When I consider the hostility of political churches to homosexuality and homosexual marriage, I do so remembering the history of Christian war, torture, terror, slavery, and annihilation against Jews, Muslims, black Africans, American Indians, and others, and more of the same by Catholics against Protestants, Protestants against Catholics, Catholics against Catholics, Protestants against Protestants, as if by law, requiring the love of God to be balanced by hatred of some neighbor for the sin of being unlike some divinely preferred us. If we are a Christian nation, as some say we are, using the adjective with conventional looseness, then this Christian bloodthirst continues wherever we find an officially identifiable evil, and to the immense enrichment of our Christian industries of war. Condemnation by category is the lowest form of hatred, for it is cold-hearted and abstract, lacking the heat and even the courage of a personal hatred. Categorical condemnation is the hatred of the mob, which makes cowards brave. And there is nothing more fearful than a religious mob, a mob overflowing with righteousness, as at the crucifixion and before and since. This can happen only after we have made a categorical refusal of kindness to heretics, foreigners, enemies, or any other group different from ourselves. Perhaps the most dangerous temptation to Christianity is to get itself officialized in some version by a government, following pretty exactly the pattern of the chief priest and his crowd at the trial of Jesus. For want of a pilot of their own, some Christians would accept a Constantine, or whomever might be the current incarnation of Caesar. Kindness is not a word much at home in current political and religious speech, but it is a rich word and a necessary one. There is good reason to think that we cannot live without it. Kind obviously is related to kin, but also to race and to nature. In the Middle Ages, kind and nature were synonyms. Equal, in the famous phrase of the Declaration of Independence, could be well translated by these terms. All men are created kin to one another, or of a kind, or of the same race or nature. Jesus saves the life of the woman taken in adultery by removing her from the category in which her accusers, another mob, have placed her, and placing her within kindness, his own kindness first, and then that of her accusers. He that is without sin among you, let him first cast a stone at her. The accusers take this kindness as a defeat, as we all are too likely to do, and they depart without another word. The brief dialogue that follows is wonderfully animated by Jesus' sense of humor. Woman, where are those thine accusers? Hath no man condemned thee? No man, Lord. Neither do I condemn thee. Go and sin no more. Good advice. But can we suppose he could have given it without smiling, knowing as he did the vast repertory of sins and the endless human susceptibility? Within the larger story of the Gospels, this story is not exceptional. It does show us Jesus' way of dealing with one of the biblically denominated sins. But he simply reaches out to the woman in her great need, as he did many times to many others. In the Gospels, the sinfulness of humans is assumed. It is a universal. It is neediness that is exceptional. And in Jesus' ministry, clearly takes a certain precedence over sin. His kindness is best exemplified by his feedings and healings with no imputation at all of sin or deserving to the beneficiaries. But the wealth of this idea of kindness is not exhausted by kindness to humans. It is far more encompassing. Coming from as far back among Christians at least as the 12th century, certainly from farther back in so-called primitive cultures, cropping up again in the thought of some ecologists of our own time, is the idea of a great kindness, including and binding together all beings, the living and the non-living, the plants and animals, the water, the air, the stones. All ultimately are of a kind, belonging together interdependently in this world. From the point of view of Genesis 1 or of the 104th Psalm, we would say that all are of one kind, one kinship, one nature, because all are creatures. Much happiness, much joy can come to us from our membership in a kindness so comprehensive and original. It is a shame, as I know from long acquaintance with myself, to be divided from it by the autoerotic pleasure of despising other members.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Berry. I appreciate that. And those are particularly the conclusion there with this moving appeal to kindness, which, as I hear you speak, so closely resonates with your appeal to it all turning on affection that we have all benefited from. There's so much of what you've said there that I certainly not only agree with but wholeheartedly endorse. The government does not control our souls, and particularly as Baptists, we have a great interest in wanting to affirm that and remind them that they don't control our souls. I think the difficulty and I don't have obviously any difficulty with recognizing the inadequacy of our current labels of liberal and conservative and the way these two political parties push us toward extremes and evacuate any kind of reasonable middle ground. I do have difficulty with figuring out the place of rights in the church. As Alistair McIntyre very famously said, rights, like telescopes and wigs for gentlemen, are 17th century inventions. A right is a claim that I am entitled to make against a community. And it is a political term. It is a term of statecraft. And much of our problem with marriage today is the importation of the language of rights into marriage. Rights in marriage are most appropriate in bad situations. If a woman is being abused, if there is something that is wrong, there's a violation of rights here. But when I begin to assert my rights against my wife, most of the time these are selfish instances in which I'm thinking about my own good as opposed to the common good of our community. And in the church, in the body of Christ, we have to be very careful about the role that we have in using rights. And I think that this is something that we're probably largely in agreement with. I mean, you're speaking of the political nature of marriage. The real question that I think for Christians as we go forward here, there is no question about kindness, there is no question about forgiveness, there is no question about our own human frailty and our need for forgiveness and redemption, is the question of what will we think of this institution of marriage, and what is it that we demand from it? We do make extraordinary demands. But those come, I think, from the ecclesial community as it most properly is understood. If there are domestic partnerships and these are government categories, that's not that is not for the church to think that it should underwrite or be involved. If the marriage that is a purely natural and private one that Mr. Berry is speaking of here, with no relationship to that is certainly within the realm of possibility. But as Christians begin to think about how we will administer this that we claim is a sacrament, then we have to understand what the implications of those are and how they are extended and what they should be extended to. And I am not yet persuaded on the ecclesial question here. I would love to be persuaded. I appreciate your insights and your comments. Thank you very much.